If you're exhausted, brain fogged, inflamed, and struggling to function while your spouse seems relatively okay, and you keep thinking, gosh, this seems like mold illness, it's all the same symptoms, but it can't be because my spouse is seemingly fine. I hate to break it to you, but that's not true. You can be really sick from your home while others that live there seem relatively okay or maybe even unaffected. And this is actually a really common story that maybe only 2 out of 4 family members get really sick in a moldy home, while the others can function fine. Or only a quarter of the people in a toxic office building are having significant health challenges, and they're all having maybe different health challenges. This kept me confused for a long time and delayed my own healing. And what I know now as a biotoxin illness expert is that that difference between people does not prove that the environment is safe for everyone. And it does not prove that your symptoms must have some other cause. It also does not mean that there's something inherently wrong with you or whoever the sick person is, and that you just need to fix yourself instead of the environment. People living in the same water damage building often have completely different symptoms and symptom severity, and that's for many different reasons. I know that this very confusion can create immense conflict within families and lead to the sick people remaining sick for far longer than they should. And I don't want that to be you or your loved one. So, in this video, I'm going to explain why these differences between people exist and why it's critical to listen to the signs from the sick person's body as soon as possible. Because many of the complications of mold and biotoxin illness are preventable, but only if the exposure stops. I'm Dr. Karen Curitin. I'm a naturopathic doctor specializing in mold and biotoxin illness and nervous system health. I've helped people with complex chronic illness heal for more than a decade, and I have also experienced complex chronic illness due to mold toxicity myself. And what I'm going to dive into today is one of the top 10 things I wish I had known earlier in life that could have spared me from over 15 years of mold related chronic illness. And if you want to know the other 9, check out my video about the top 10 things I wish I had known before I got sick. I'll link to it at the end of this video. So, I have been the canary in the coal mine for mold in buildings since I was a kid, starting with when my playroom in my childhood home flooded. And suddenly I had horrific allergies and sinus issues that plagued me for years. And they didn't really stop until I stopped spending time in that room. And then as I got older, a whole bunch of other factors in my life compounded, and I became an even more sensitive canary. And even once I knew that mold toxicity was what was making me sick, it took a long time for me to piece together why I was so much sicker from it than other people sharing the same environment. There were many times when I was barely functioning while someone else living, working, or going to school in that same building seemed relatively okay. As an example from my own life, I got so ill from a toxic mold exposure in my now husband's apartment before we moved in together. And I was tolerating his apartment fine for over a year before that. And then his washing machine flooded all over the floor. He mopped up the water as you would, but he didn't remediate appropriately. And I knew very little about mold toxicity and remediation at that time, and I didn't think much about it. But several weeks later, I started to feel absolutely awful every time I went over there and for days afterwards. It was horrendous, and I was really struggling to function. I was having constant sinus headaches, brain fog, fatigue, insomnia, and all over body aches after every visit. And I finally had to say, I'm sorry, I just can't come over to your place anymore. He, on the other hand, was doing okay. And in retrospect, he actually did have signs of toxic mold exposure too, but they weren't debilitating. So for him, it flared his psoriasis horribly. He also had horrendous candida overgrowth both inside his digestive tract and on his skin. He was having candida rashes. And during that time, he was getting constant and horrific dental infections. One root canal after another kept failing, and abscesses were developing, and he was at the dentist's office constantly. He also had some horrific seasonal allergies, really frequent migraines, and needed 5 cups of coffee to get through the day. And he was having pretty extreme sugar addiction that he couldn't break. And, none of those issues were debilitating. None of them prevented him from going to work every day and doing the things he wanted to do. So he thought it must not be the environment because he was, air quotes, fine. All of these issues that he was having are actually common effects of toxic mold exposure, but I didn't know that yet. And the difference in our reactions confused me for years. It made me question whether the environment could really be the problem. And I now understand that there are many reasons people react differently to the same toxic mold exposure, and I'm going to share those today. I also now know that when people say their other family members are unaffected, that I should look a little bit deeper and ask a few questions because sometimes they are quote unquote functioning, but they are still being affected. So before we continue, I need to mention that this video provides general educational information only. It's not designed to diagnose or treat any illness or medical condition. And your symptoms, your health history should always be evaluated and treated by your own personal healthcare practitioner. Now, let's get into the reasons one person could be more affected by a water damaged building than another. Reason number one, you may not be receiving the same exposure. You might think that two people living in the same home are having the same amount of exposure, but that's often not the case. The person who spends the most time closest to the toxic source is the one having the biggest exposure and is more likely to get sicker than other people in the same house because they are getting the highest dose of the poison. So, as an example, if your child's bedroom shares a wall with a bathroom and that bathroom wall had a leak and has mold growing inside the wall, your kids who spend 8 hours sleeping next to that wall are likely to be more affected than you are if your bedroom is on the opposite side of the house because they're getting more exposure and because their bodies are smaller, right? Another good example of different exposure levels is, let's say you work from home, a home with toxic mold growing in it, but your partner goes to work every day and has a healthy work environment. Well, your partner is getting 8 hours or more away from the toxic exposure, and therefore their body is getting a lower dose of toxins and is better able to keep up with detoxification of those. Another situation, though, is that sometimes someone in the family is getting exposed in two places, and that may actually be why they are sicker. So, if your child is getting exposed both at home and at school, they may actually be sicker than you, who's only getting one exposure at home. And that may be because they're getting exposed to different toxins, different microbes in the other environment, right? Maybe other mold species, other bacteria, different mycotoxins, endotoxins, whatever. And the combination of what they're getting exposed to is what's overwhelming their system and making them sicker. And then, of course, sometimes the home isn't the source at all. So you may be really sick because your workplace is the source and no one else in the family goes there. So, your proximity to the source, how much time you spend there, and the duration of the exposure can all affect the dose your body is receiving. So, before assuming that everyone had the same experience, ask who spends the most time in the problematic building? Who's spending the most time closest to the source in the building? And where else is the sickest person spending a lot of time? Those answers can help explain why one person may have more severe symptoms than another. Reason number two is that different bodies have different vulnerabilities. Exposure is only one side of the equation. The condition of the person at the time of the exposure also matters immensely. So, one of those factors may be pre existing conditions. Those can make a very big difference. So, if somebody has pre existing allergies or asthma, a pre existing autoimmune condition, chronic lung disease, they're taking drugs that suppress immune function or impair detoxification, all of those things can lead to them being sicker as a result of the exposure. But pre-existing diagnoses are not the only thing that can cause that. The general underlying health and resilience of each person's body, whether they've been diagnosed with a medical condition or not, impacts how much and in what ways mold will affect them. And I'm a great example of this. I had no diagnosed medical conditions when mold first made me sick, but I did have some things that had already made my terrain more susceptible. So before my first exposure, when I was maybe 7 or 8, I had already had probably easily 12 courses of antibiotics. And they were, milder antibiotics for things like strep throat and ear infections, but still quite a lot of doses of antibiotics. And I'm also one of those people who has susceptible genetics for SIRS as characterized by Dr. Richie Shoemaker. So those were my two main susceptibilities at that point. So it's not really that surprising. I seem to just have really severe allergies from the first exposure. I didn't get super sick. And I recovered easily and naturally when that exposure stopped. But by the time of my second big exposure in college, when I got much sicker, I had been on chronic antibiotics for years for teenage acne. I had taken also more broad spectrum antibiotics, which would have killed a lot more of my beneficial flora. And we'll talk about the importance of that shortly. I had taken several courses of antibiotics that are called fluoroquinolones that damage mitochondria, which are the little energy producers in every cell, and I'm going to tell you why that matters. I had been eating a poor quality, low nutrient, high carb diet for years. I was drinking alcohol regularly, and I had recently started burning the candle at both ends with late nights, not enough sleep, pushing myself really hard to achieve, and all of that was probably causing some nervous system dysregulation, immune suppression, hormonal imbalances, and just generally lower resiliency. And I had also gotten Epstein-Barr virus by that time. So when I look back, it's not surprising that I got a lot sicker the next time I had a big exposure and every exposure after that, because I had accumulated a lot more susceptibility in my terrain that made me more vulnerable to mold. So let's talk about now some of the common things that I see increase someone's vulnerability to toxic mold, even if they don't have any diagnosed medical conditions. Number one is suppressed immune function. And this can happen for a number of reasons. Immunosuppressive drugs would be a big one. That could be something even as simple as a steroid someone takes for asthma, or another type of drug they are on for an autoimmune condition. Prior toxic exposures can also suppress immune function, whether those toxins be mycotoxins, chemicals, or heavy metals, can all have immunosuppressive effects depending on what they are. Chronic stress can be highly immunosuppressive, and we have a lot of studies to back that up at this point. Chronic infections can cause immunosuppression, certain ones more so than others, but things like tick-borne infections or long COVID or chronic viral infections can all dampen immune function. Excessive sugar in the diet, we know, also can suppress immune function. And the reason a suppressed immune system will lead someone to getting sicker from mold is because the byproducts and toxins that mold produces are also immunosuppressive. So the combination tends to lead someone to getting a lot of acute and chronic infections when they're exposed to mold that their body then struggles to get rid of. And those infections come with their own symptoms. So, if somebody has Epstein-Barr virus and it flares really badly while they're in the toxic mold environment, they are likely to have more extreme fatigue and lymph swelling, brain fog, and things like that that are common with Epstein-Barr virus infections, in addition to whatever symptoms were going to happen from the mycotoxins themselves. The other reason a suppressed immune system is such a big deal with mold exposures because mold likes to live in our body if the immune system will allow it to, because we have these dark, moist environments in our sinuses and digestive tract. And these are mold's ideal living situation. There's plenty of food, it likes it nice and dark, and it likes plenty of moisture. So if the immune system is suppressed, when they have a toxic mold exposure, they're much more likely to end up with mold growing inside their body and potentially producing toxins inside their body too. So that will make someone have much more extreme symptoms than somebody who doesn't end up with the mold growing inside them. Okay, number 2, a prior history of antibiotics is something that definitely seems to make people more susceptible to toxic mold exposure. And the more antibiotics they've been on and the longer the courses, the more that tends to make people more susceptible because it weakens the microbiome. And like I talked about before, some antibiotics can also damage the little energy producers in our cells called mitochondria. Certain healthy microbes that are easily killed by antibiotics can actually break down mycotoxins for us in the gut into less toxic substances, so they can actually help us detoxify the mycotoxins. But if we don't have those microbes because we've already killed them with antibiotics, then our bodies are going to have to do all the work of detoxification ourselves, and we are likely to have more negative effects from those toxins. Those same healthy microbes can also help us resist being colonized by mold, as I was just talking about. They can help be our healthy defense against those invasions by mold that we don't want in our sinuses or digestive tract. But if we don't have those microbes, then we don't have that extra layer of defense. Number 3, hormonal imbalances. This is a complex topic. I'm not going to dive into it today, but just know that it's a susceptibility factor if somebody is already dealing with a significant hormonal imbalance of some kind. Number 4, chronic infections. As we talked about, things like Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus, human herpes virus 6, tick-borne infections, parasitic infections, chronic dental infections. All of these will commonly get out of control when someone is exposed to the immunosuppressive compounds in a water-damaged building. And so they are likely to get sicker if their immune system was already battling these infections on a day-to-day basis. And previous fungal colonization from prior mold exposure is also a big susceptibility factor. If somebody already has mold growing inside their sinuses or in their digestive tract from a prior mold exposure, these molds can produce mycotoxins in that person's body, the same toxins that make people sick from water damaged buildings. So they can be carrying around an internal toxin factory inside themselves. And the interesting thing about molds is that they will usually increase their mycotoxin production when they feel threatened by other molds in the environment. So, mold growing in your body from a prior exposure suddenly feels threatened by new mold in your environment and starts making 10 times the mycotoxins in your body. This is probably going to lead to you getting sicker than someone who's just getting the toxic exposure from the outside and not the double whammy from the inside and the outside. Number 5, nutrient deficiencies. Since a variety of nutrients are necessary for every single enzymatic process involved in detoxification, in immune function, in cellular protection, and regeneration, if someone has nutrient deficiencies, they're likely to get sicker in a water damaged building than somebody who doesn't. Number 6, nervous system dysregulation from chronic stress, nervous system patterning, trauma, and similar things. Nervous system dysregulation is a powerful susceptibility factor because the autonomic nervous system controls all the automatic functions of our body. And when we are spending a lot of time in fight, flight, or freeze, it leads to impaired digestion, nutrient absorption, and even leaky gut. It also leads to impaired detoxification, impaired and imbalanced immune function, and impaired tissue repair. All of the functions that you need to be working at top notch for resilience in the face of a toxic exposure. So, when someone enters an exposure already sleep deprived, overwhelmed, overworking, or living in a prolonged state of stress, the body is going to have less capacity to adapt to the major stressor that is a big toxic exposure. Number 7, mitochondrial damage or dysfunction. Mitochondria are the little energy producers in every single cell. They make the energy every cell needs to do its job. So, if the mitochondria have been damaged or impaired and aren't able to make enough energy, this weakens every cell's capacity to withstand toxin damage. And even prior to a toxic mold exposure, our mitochondria can be damaged by other types of toxins, pharmaceutical drugs, certain types of infections, such as COVID-19. All of these things can impair or damage our mitochondria and leave us more exposed to more significant effects from mold. Because the thing about mycotoxins is that many of them also very easily damage the mitochondria, leaving someone in an even more depleted state. And often people with significant mitochondrial damage are the ones that are going to get the most extremely fatigued from toxic mold exposure. So, number 8 is already having some reason why your body is struggling to eliminate toxins. And this can be something as simple as constipation, right? Pooping is one way that your body uses to get toxins out of the body. And if we are constipated, toxins are more likely to get reabsorbed in the distal bowel and recirculate in the bloodstream as opposed to getting out of the body. Other things can be impaired bile production or excretion, not sweating on any kind of regular basis, chronic dehydration, because we need to get a lot of toxins out through the urine, drugs that impair detoxification, not moving and therefore not moving your lymph enough to get toxins circulated and then out of the body. Number 9 would be leaky gut. And this can happen for a lot of reasons. Two of the most common things are from food allergies or intolerances, chronic stress, and ultra processed diet and other toxins. These things can all lead to leaky gut. And the effect that that has is that toxins are more likely to get absorbed out of the digestive tract when the body is trying to get them out in the stool. And so the person will have more negative systemic effects from those toxins entering the bloodstream as opposed to getting pushed out of the body in the bowels. Number 10 would be prior toxin exposures. I've brought this up under many other categories already, but a variety of different types of toxins can weaken or damage the body in various ways. And if those toxins are still in the body, then they can be taxing the system already. So those could be prior mold toxins or other toxins from water damaged buildings, chemicals, and heavy metals. A high sugar processed food, low nutrient, low fiber diet can also be a susceptibility factor because molds and yeasts and things like that like to eat sugar. And so if you're eating a high sugar diet, then these critters are more likely to get excited about living inside your body and setting up shop there because there is plenty of their favorite food always available. If your diet is a low nutrient diet, that's going to likely lead to some nutrient deficiencies. So, some of the body functions you need to be resilient to mold are not going to be working optimally. And then a low fiber diet is going to lead to more reabsorption of toxins in the digestive tract as opposed to them getting excreted in your stool. And number 12 is genetics. There are a variety of that can make us more susceptible to toxic mold exposure. And these include the HLA haplotypes characterized by Dr. Shoemaker. You don't have to have these genetics to become sick from mold. Virtually anyone can become sick from toxic mold if exposed to high enough amounts of toxins for long enough. So I just want to be clear about that. We see in both human and animal studies that these mycotoxins have documented negative health effects, regardless of the genes. And so you do not have to have these genetics to become sick from mold. But these haplotypes, HLA haplotypes, which about 25% of people have, we think, make someone genetically unable to make antibodies to these toxins and other biotoxins. And when we can't make these antibodies, it makes it more difficult for our body to get the toxins out. So the toxins end up getting stuck in the body and recirculating over and over again. And this leads to what Dr. Richie Shoemaker has called chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS. I am one of these people with this genetic susceptibility. But I also want to state very clearly that even if you have this genetic propensity, you can still get well. So don't despair and think it is a death sentence or that you're going to be sick for the rest of your life because you have these genetics. Absolutely not. If you have these genes, it's okay. You can still get well. There are also other genes involved in detoxification processes, antioxidant production, and other functions that can play a role in someone's susceptibility to toxic mold. The truth is that how these genes are being expressed also plays a big role in the person's susceptibility. So that's called epigenetics, how those genes are being expressed. And that is more difficult to assess. So those are some of the things that I find make people more susceptible to get sicker from toxic mold exposure. And depending on which of these susceptibility factors they have, we may see different symptoms from the same exposure, right? So one person may have a history of tons of antibiotics and they have primarily horrible dysbiosis and fungal overgrowth and things like that in a toxic mold exposure. And somebody else may have mitochondrial damage from previous drugs or toxin exposures, and they end up having horrible fatigue and brain fog because the mitochondria were their susceptibility point, and somebody else comes into a toxic exposure already with allergies, asthma, and autoimmunity, and they have a flare of all of those conditions, which the symptoms would look very different from, right? So you can see how even two people having the same exact exposure can end up sick in very different ways. And depending on what their life history entailed before the exposure, may get more or less sick. And then the other thing to consider is what chronic stressors a person is under at the same time as the exposure. These might include things like pregnancy or recovering from having had birth recently, having surgery or recent surgery, getting or recovering from COVID or another significant infection, current sleep deprivation, intense emotional stress or grief or loss or overworking or raising young children, relationship abuse, all those kinds of things are going to affect how and how much resources a person's body has to respond to exposure. Poor diet, dehydration. I consider all of these potential concurrent stressors that make it harder for someone's body to remain resilient and symptom free in a toxic environment. Think about two people trying to carry the same really heavy box. One person begins the day rested and well fed and physically strong and like ready to take on the day. And the other person already carried 20 boxes throughout the night, only slept 4 hours, and also injured their shoulder last week. The box weighs the same, but their capacity to carry it is not. And that's how I think about susceptibility. It's not a character flaw. It's the relationship between the burden being placed on the body and the capacity the body has available at that time. And then I want to highlight one of those categories I just brought up as a big one, and that's previous exposure to other water damaged buildings. Because the current building may not be the first piece of that person's story. Sometimes people have lived, worked, or attended school in multiple water damaged building environments without knowing it over a long period of time. And then they move into another water damaged building and become dramatically ill. And it can appear that the most recent exposure caused the entire problem overnight. But in reality, it may have just been the straw that broke the camel's back. And the body may have been coping to the extent that you didn't even know that it was facing this extreme stress. And then more stressors piled on, more antibiotics, more toxins. And then finally, the whole house of cards fell down. This happened to me. My health problems did not come from just one exposure. Looking back, I had many exposures that were pretty constant over many years. And with each move from one old dank apartment to another, or school building, or laboratory, or workplace, my symptoms would change. Often new symptoms would appear. And for the most part, my health gradually got worse over the course of those 15 years before I knew that toxic mold exposure was what was going on. And by the time of my last exposure, my body was not starting from zero. It had already sustained years of damage from relatively constant mycotoxin exposures to my gut, my microbiome, my mitochondria, my brain, my hormonal system, and my immune system. And then my sinuses and digestive tract eventually got colonized, and I developed an internal toxin factory. And by that time, my immune system already knew mold and mycotoxins as a dangerous foe and wasted no time in reacting to the exposure. So somebody might say, well, mold never bothered me before. And that might be true. They may have tolerated earlier exposures without noticeable symptoms, but tolerance in the past does not guarantee unlimited tolerance in the future. Our bodies are not static in their resilience. Many factors are at play, and prior exposures are one of those factors. So, what if you are the only sick person in the house? Being the only person in your home or workplace that's disabled by illness or even visibly sick can be profoundly isolating. You really may start questioning your body or feeling like it has betrayed you. Your spouse may question whether your illness is real, may question the cost of testing and inspection and remediation. A landlord may point to the other tenants and say, well, nobody else has complained. And even a doctor who isn't well educated in environmental illness may assume the shared environmental exposure should affect everyone the same way. But that's just not how biology works. People do not respond identically to pollen, infections, medications, cigarette smoke, food, air pollution, anything. So we should not expect identical responses to the complex toxic and microbial environment of a water damaged building either. And the truth is, that person that appears okay is still being impacted. It just may not be visible or obvious. Sometimes the impact of toxin exposure isn't visible for a long time. Take cigarette smoke, for example. People can smoke for 20 years before they get lung cancer. So don't use another person's lack of symptoms as a reason to dismiss the environment as a potential cause for yours. Do not use your susceptibility as a reason to blame yourself. Label yourself as defective or as the problem. Susceptibility does not mean that you are defective or that you need to fix yourself. Your body is letting you know that for whatever reason, that environment is not okay for your body at that time. Your body is intelligent. It knows when to sound the alarm. You may be the canary, but the canary deserves health and safety just as much as the miners who might tolerate that toxic mining environment a little longer. So you have my encouragement to listen to your body. I wish I had known what my body was trying to say when this all began for me, so I could have saved myself many years of illness. So start gathering information on your own, even if you don't have support from others yet. It's your body. You are its protector. And if it's your child that's sick, you are its protector. We can't depend on others to do this for us or even to necessarily be okay with it. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep going when our body is telling us something is wrong. So you can start by taking the free mold illness questionnaire, making a list of the susceptibility factors that I mentioned today and checking off which ones you have, noting if your symptoms began after a move of home or workplace or school, after a renovation, a leak, a flood, a condensation issue, a plumbing problem, roof damage, a musty odor, or visible growth started. And note how much time you or whoever the sick person is spends near the suspected source. And finally, test, don't guess. You can test both your body and your home for confirmation. And I recommend you get professional help with knowing the right testing to do and how to do them to get accurate results. But in conclusion, the reason one person gets sick from mold while another person appears fine usually cannot be reduced to one factor. The person who reacts first is often the person whose body just reached its limit first. And that deserves to be taken seriously. And if you have experienced being the only sick person in your home or workplace, leave a comment for me and tell me what happened. Your experience may help another person stop dismissing the signals that their body has been sending them, and also help all the other canaries feel less alone. And if I missed something that you think made you more susceptible to toxic mold, share it in the comments below so other people can learn from your experience too. If this video helped you understand this topic, please give it a like and share it with somebody else who might need to hear it. And if you like this content, consider subscribing as I have a lot more like it to come. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.